Howdy, I'm Jammer. So, um, my friend is out and about today because I want to talk a little bit about multimedia experience, particularly how it relates to comics. Because originally my thought process was I'm going to hop into understanding comics and then start doing just like a chapter by chapter review of that book while occasionally maybe hopping back and forth between other books. But recently, I finished a graphic novel that, in and of itself, is not terribly memorable, but I still think is really important in terms of discussions of comics as a medium and how commercial enterprise and capitalistic enterprise can affect a reader's experience of a text, and more importantly, how it can affect a reader's just general perception of a book. Now, the book under discussion is Mad Max by George Miller. Now, immediately, I can kind of anticipate a reaction. It's like, dude, for real? Like, what is this? This, in fact, is a graphic novel, which, as you can tell by the cover of the book, is a tie in to the blockbuster movie Mad Max Fury Road. Now, this film came out, I believe, originally in 2014. Now, when it came out, it created one controversy among some of the fanboys who were like, Mad Max and women, but whatever, who cares? But it also created a lot of buzz because a Mad Max movie came out. A lot of people had seen the, to quote Key and Peele, racist ass Mel Gibson movies from the past before he became that. And so people were expecting a certain type of film, aka they were expecting more or less an uber masculine 80s action flick starring the apocalypse and badass cars, what have you. Instead, what they got was a badass action movie with a pretty solid message about feminism, about the abuses of patriarchy, and just about individual will and liberty. This is a really, really great movie, and I would recommend it to anybody, even if you've never seen a Mad Max movie. In fact, especially if you haven't seen a Mad Max movie, hop into this one, then go see the original ones. But this one is most definitely worth your time, and I think it's a damn shame that they haven't come up with a sequel for it yet, or at least a continuation of it. But anyway, the movie came out, I fell in love, I obviously bought a Blu-ray copy of it, and I watched it again and again and again because holy hell, I love this movie so much. But then that's it, and no subsequent films have come out, no other intellectual properties connected to it. And then life kind of went on. I bought a lot more comic books and lived my life. And then one day, when I was traveling with my family to the Half Price Books in Dallas, I was just perusing the shelves and I stumbled upon this book here. And again, like I said, it's exactly what you would think it is. It is exactly, let me find a good page for it, because I want to find a good picture of Immortan Joe. Yeah, so you can kind of see it's more or less just a continuation of the Mad Max comics. What this is, it's a four-issue collection that goes into at least each of the different characters in the story. So, Immortan Joe, the old grisly war monger who basically controls his wives. Um, Furiosa, aka the Sharon, or excuse me, Charlize Theron character, who has the arm missing, and she is just a total badass. It goes into a little bit into Mad Max himself and his efforts to kind of just survive the barren wasteland. And then honestly, after that, there's kind of like a final story, which is a continuation of Mad Max, but it's also like just a little blurb to kind of tie everything together. And this is Mad Max at its core. You see one story where Max gets in basically to a gladiator type fight, and the prize ultimately is an engine for a car. And it's everything you could possibly want. Dude throws a chainsaw at Mad Max. It's just great. But does this create more of a deeper experience? Like, okay, it's a fun story, but like, does this comic book was this comic book merited? I mean, we have the movie. Do we really need a comic book addition to it? To which case, the question is, why not? Which then also made me start thinking about some of the other comics I have on my shelves, and then made me think, how often do we really look at one media as a continuation or an extension of another? All right, I moved him back, but it's ultimately just sort of so I've got a little bit more room here in the front. But on the note, you'll observe again, as always, because I keep putting him right there up at the front, I have a Doomslayer statue. I bought it because I recently bought the 2016 version of Doom because, again, I just got out of a divorce. I'm living alone. I'm in the middle of a pandemic. Why not treat myself a little bit? So I bought it, and I have become obsessed with that game. And so, in my obsession, or just in my adoration and nerddom, I went out and I bought a small statue of the Doomslayer because he's freaking cool. Again, it's my way of enjoying the universe of Doom. But there's a fundamental difference between playing the video game Doom and appreciating this statue. Ultimately, they're both works of art, but they're existing in different mediums. The video game is what primarily got me interested in that creative universe. It's an immersive, interactive experience. There's no way really for me to interact here with the Doomslayer except to look at him and go, holy crap, he's so cool. This is a far more passive experience because I look at it and I don't really have to react, or I, more importantly, don't have to act in any way. I can just look at him and go, he's cool. This is kind of important, again, because as always when we're talking about media studies, we have to understand really what we're talking about in terms of how the reader, the viewer, the appreciator, that's going to be a random new word for the record, interacts with the medium. If you're watching the movie Mad Max, there's not really a lot for you to do except just watch the movie. You watch Furiosa steal a car. You watch Mad Max shoot people. You watch the dude in the bungee cord with the heavy metal guitar shooting flames out of the end of his guitar. You watch the way I kind of watch or look at the Doomslayer. But again, comics is different for reasons that I'll talk a lot more about when we get into understanding comics. Again, when I showed you the man with the top hat here, again, we have the man wearing the top hat, and then he takes it off. There's no art in between to show the hat coming off. We just have this one gutter right here. And what that gutter does is imply that time and space have changed. Cue Mad Max. It's easy for me to watch the Mad Max movie and go, okay, Mad Max is being chased by dudes, he's hopping in his car. The film is moving the images for me so I can see time and space move. If I can go back to this panel here for a second, Mad Max is in the fight, this dude covered with armor kills a couple people, and we see him, one, drop this guy, kill another guy, and then suddenly this chainsaw is flying. The indication is he has killed some people, grabbed the chainsaw, and then thrown it at Mad Max. But we don't see it happening piece by piece by piece by piece. We, the reader, have to imagine this fight sequence. Now again, the way that the artist and the writer arrange these panels together and arrange these scenes can help us do that. And again, take a look here at the way we see the motion of him throwing something, we see the chainsaw coming at him, and then again through the use of onomatopoeia, we hear the sound of the back of the chainsaw striking into Mad Max's back. So again, there's all the elements of the media that we saw before in previous videos. But again, we're reading Mad Max, and while reading Mad Max's comic, we're creating these scenes and moments in our mind and in our imagination. It requires a lot more effort on the part of the reader, and this is where we run into problems sometimes, because it's easy to look at a Mad Max comic as nothing more than just cheap propaganda to make more money for the studio that's putting this out. And in some cases, we've seen stuff like this a lot. A new movie comes out, and merchandise. We see a comic run, we see the novelization, we see what have you. But at the same time, it's easy to dismiss these kind of accompanying media because our attitude can be, well, it's just promotion, it's not really an attempt at art. But is it? Again, something like Picasso's Guernica is probably not going to stand up next to a Mad Max comic book, but it's also a bad comparison because it's not the right medium. A much better one would be put aside Sandman next to this Mad Max comic book, and yeah, it's probably not going to last. But at the same time, sometimes something interesting happens. Because if you'll remember a previous video, I talked about these guys, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. These guys started as comics, but then eventually became so much merchandise. They became action figures, they became t-shirts, sleeping bags, animated television shows, video games, a multi-movie series, and that Michael Bay thing that we're not going to talk about. But the point is that if you look at the example of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the original media was comics. But not a lot of people really recognize Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles as comics. They probably think of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the TV show, or the video game, maybe the t-shirt. The question, or the interesting question starts to become, what media begins to matter most to the individual viewer? Because for some people, this is the real Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Whereas somebody else may watch the movies from the past and go, no, that's the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. That's the media that I selectively choose to endorse with my time and energy. And this can also create interesting dynamics when, how you say, tie-ins can essentially become their own animal. I'll give you a couple, or at least two more examples. This book here, Batman Arkham City, this is a graphic novelization which was a tie-in to the video game for PS3 that came out several years ago. Now you'll note also, it says the lead-in to the highly anticipated video game. So right off the bat, the makers of this graphic novel are pretty upfront and honest. They're like, hey, this is a comic to get you ready for the game. This is one media experience to prepare you for the next media experience. But at the same time, it would be a mistake to write this book off because right off the bat, you have Paul Dini writing this book. And if you've never heard of Paul Dini, he was one of the lead creative directors behind the television show Batman the Animated Series, a show which, even to this day, is still one of the gold standards of superhero animation. He also went on to do Superman the Animated Series. He did a lot of work for the Justice League, and he is largely responsible for the creation and development of the character Harley Quinn. And if you look at this book especially, this is actually a pretty solid book. I've read it once before. I actually intended to read it and do a whole video unto itself, kind of on this topic. But I wanted to bring it in again to really show you that we're talking about a real, legit moment where we have comics tying in to another type of media. It would be easy to just say, okay, this is just promotion for the video game. But if you take the time and effort to read this book, it's a solid Batman story. And so, the question then becomes is, does this book become disqualified simply because it was made solely to tie into a video game? For my own part, I don't think so, because one, Paul Dini is awesome. There's a couple of his books I'm like, but still, it's a good book, it's great, it's really well written, and the art is pretty decent. Now, there's, I said there was going to be two more. I'm actually going to throw in two more examples here. So, one of my favorite books of all time is Fun Home, a family tragic comic by Alison Bechdel. Now, if you've never heard of Alison Bechdel, she's the writer of the comic strip Essential Dykes to Watch Out For, Dykes to Watch Out For. The series is exactly what the title suggests. It's about just a small group of friends who are lesbians. Its strip is set during the 1990s, and it's just basically about their life. It's about being women, being queer, and just having relationships, heartbreak, romance, breakups, real life. Alison Bechdel more or less established her street cred with these comics by publishing them in a lot of feminist magazines, a lot of lesbian magazines, and then eventually she came out with this book here, which is a memoir of her life growing up, as well as a tie-in to sort of her emotional process of coming to grips with her father's suicide. Now, you've probably heard of Fun Home, because either A, you've heard of this comic, or you've heard of the Broadway musical, which is directly inspired and taken from this comic. This is another instance, again, where a comic has started something which has created a different media experience. There are some people who are going to sing the song Ring of Keys, so good, over and over and over again, and they're never going to pick up this book because for them, the Broadway musical is the media experience they care about. And then one last example to hopefully kind of tie my whole soapbox together. Holy crap, this video is hitting at 10 minutes. This is a lot longer than I wanted this to be. But one last example I really want to talk about is what happens sometimes when a franchise or a story or a narrative begins in one medium, it's transferred into another medium for the sake of promotion, and then in that new medium more or less assumes a life of its own. Again, as I mentioned in a previous video, I'm very good friends with the co-owner of my local comic book shop, and he is obsessed with the franchise Aliens. He has alien action figures. He gave his newly born son an alien plushie figure recently. He's got face huggers all of his apartment, posters for all the movies, extensive knowledge of all of the lore. He even, true story, has one of the books from the movie Prometheus. As in, one of the books in Miss Vickers' office, he owns one of the books. It's that level of dedication, and I just admire him so much for it. One nerd to another. Endless love, dude. But anyway, Aliens specifically got its run through the publisher Dark Horse. Not long after the original Alien and Aliens movie came out, eventually Dark Horse got the licensing rights to start producing Aliens comics. But what happened is, more or less, you got a run of different stories because different writers would come. It was kind of sometimes a way to just get your start in comics, or sometimes to continue on your career to show, hey, I can do superheroes, but then I can also do stuff like this. I can do independent comics, what have you. Whatever the case, there were decades of Alien comics, and Dark Horse for years held the rights to it. Now, the recent Disney acquisition of 20th Century Fox has kind of created a little bit of a licensing issues, and it's very unlikely we're going to be seeing any more Aliens comics for this foreseeable future, which is, I have opinions on it. But what's really important here is that the Alien comics have an extensive lore. And even though movies like Prometheus have come about and introduced new figures and characters like the Engineers and David, what have you, fans of the Alien comics have close to about 2 decades, perhaps even, actually I think it's more like 3 decades of comics to fall back on, so that even if they don't like the new movies, they can go to these comics. And having recently completed this, the Essential Comics, collects some of the first 3 of the major storylines, this is an amazing graphic novel series. And the Alien comics are substantial works of art. Even just looking at some of the artwork, and I'm going to see if I can't find just like one good page to really show you what I'm talking about here. Oh my gosh, yes. Looking at just these 2 pages alone, you can kind of see this is good artwork. And if you actually go into the story, you get a far deeper glimpse into the lives of the characters of Hicks and Ripley and Newt, characters that were established in the films, but now we get to observe even more of their life and, dare I say, adventures. It's not really much of an adventure if you're being pursued by a xenomorph. But the point is, there are millions of people who have read Alien comics, and they've embraced them. And for some people, the Alien comic scene and the Alien novels are a more real continuation of the series than Alien Covenant, which I'm not ready to talk about that. Anyway, end of the soapbox. You can see, and I'm just going to stack this all up again for you. There's a great amount of material here, and I've only provided a couple of examples of books, which are either just tie-ins to movies, sort of continuation or prequels to movies, or else comics that started off as comics and then more or less kind of disappeared into a new medium. Again, if I can use the example of my good buddy Doomslayer here, which I'll bring him a little far forward now because, God, he's so cool. But, again, when we're talking about the medium of comics, because of its unique history as a medium, because it's still a relatively new medium in terms of how you say cultural realization, and because it's still really bogged down in a lot of capitalism, it's really easy to look at comics like this Mad Max graphic novel and go, who cares? It's just plug in for a movie. It's not really that great comics. This is never going to compare to something like Watchmen or Mouse. I'd say that's a fair comparison. Yes, this Mad Max comic book is not as good as Watchmen. It's not as good as Mouse. But it was still a nice, fun read, and it gave me an opportunity to explore a world that I fell in love in 2014, and I haven't gotten any more of since. I want more stories of Furiosa. I want more Mad Max. I want more. Well, no, I don't. I don't want more. Anyway, the point is, I love this universe. I love this story. This film inspired me because it was a continuation of an old universe, and it felt like there was some new energy to it. And so, maybe if I can offer maybe one last parting summation, this my whole argument here is essentially is it's easy to dismiss some comics tie-ins to major motion pictures or what have you, because at that point they're not really seen as their own independent organism. They're seen as a continuation or a supplement. But I think what's really important is if we're going to study comics, if we're going to appreciate comics, we still have to appreciate the fact that just because we're moving from one medium to the other, just because I spend an hour stomping imps into the dirt, doesn't mean that this statue is any less so. It's just a different experience. And so as we look at how we embrace media, how we consume media, and how comics as a media works, it's really important to understand that just because something is connected in a different form of media, it's not necessarily disqualifying. Like all things in life, it's the content that matters, it's the structure that matters. If this was a bad book, I would say so. It's not. It's, to quote a good friend of mine, a popcorn book. I read it, I got entertained, it was worth the $5. So, yeah, I think that's it. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I've tried to make this kind of a short video because, again, I knew there really wasn't much I was going to be able to talk to about this particular Mad Max strip, although there are a lot of really great moments in it. Anyway, if you would like to check this book out, go to your local comic book shop, see if they've got a copy of it. It is a Vertigo imprint, and Vertigo is not necessarily around anymore. I think it's now Black Label Books. There's some details with the company. It got like a internal restructuring because it wasn't doing well financially. But it's a Vertigo book, which means it's an imprint of DC, which means it should be relatively easy to track down, depending on how many copies exist anymore. And if you can't find it there, as always, definitely check out your local library. And thank you, whoever you are, wherever you are, for watching this. I really appreciate it. Please like, share, subscribe if you think I'm cool, or if you just want to laugh at me for 5 minutes, hey, I can take it. Also, as always, feel free to leave comments in the comment section below, either just comics that you think are really cool and you want to share with me, suggestions for future videos and other books that you'd like me to talk about, or hey, if you like Doom, tell me about it, because, like, rip and tear. Alright, I'm going to stop trying to be cool, goof that I am. Thank you again for watching. Go read some comics.